Okay, we're going crazy. I'm going crazy today. It's a Thirsty Thursday edition of Liquid Lunch on Biz TV. I'm going crazy today about the corruption I think I'm seeing at the highest levels of our government. One of the tools of the left that we've been seeing for months now is the BLM and the Antifa organizations causing chaos in the streets and all this other stuff, okay? Behind the Black Lives Matter movement, okay, Black Lives Matter as a sentence is something that every sane human can agree with. Of course, Black Lives Matter. You put a hashtag in front of it and say Black Lives Matter, that is a front organization for a bunch of Marxists. Okay, if you know anything about Marxism and these trained Marxists, one of the key tenets is to remove our individualism. And another key tenet, probably the key top tenet, is the breakdown of the nuclear family. And that's what our country was basically formed on, faith, family, freedom, okay? And when you see groups pointedly and proactively trying to break down the nuclear family, that's the beginning of the erosion of our society, okay? And someone who is an expert in explaining what leads to the total collapse of societies is Dr. Amara Sabic-El-Rayess. She's an activist, she's an author, she's a Muslim refugee. And she's an authority on rebuilding societies that have fallen into chaos. She's a professor. She lectures on radicalization and corruption at Columbia University. So she's in the top of her field. She's got a doctorate in international education, so she studies this stuff. Doctor, first, thank you so much for joining us today and lending us your sage advice on this stuff. But I have been saying for a while on this show that BLM is a front organization for a bunch of Marxists, and they're committed to the breakdown of the nuclear family. Is that the place where societies through history have started eroding and corroding?
May. And here's a statement that I think everyone would agree with that I will make, and that is that anytime white supremacist far right or any far left movement emerges and predicates its existence or survival on eliminating others, dehumanizing and othering any ethnic, religious, or racial group, that is when we run into the problems. And the reason I say that is because I personally have survived genocide against Bosnian Muslims in early 1990s. I was born hated. I grew up in a system where I was not represented in the books that I read, in the math problems that I have solved. And as a result, that kind of exclusion over time, in fact, fed into visceral hatred towards Bosnian Muslims and ultimately genocide. So I survived for 4 years without access to electricity, access to outside world, under constant bombing by Serbia, and Serbs who aspire to achieve ethnically or racially pure nation in the Balkans. And as a result, survived some horrific experiences, including losing members of my family. So my book, The Cat I Never Named, is really a book that is calling on Americans to recognize that hate is not where we want to go. Any kind of extremism, and I teach a course on Islam education and radicalization. So any form of extremism that looks to exercise its power through violence is not what we want to espouse in America as the Americans.
I know even the highest levels of our government, the policymakers here in the U.S. State Department and leaders of NGOs and foreign governments have relied on you for your expertise in this area. One of the things I know is that communists and socialists and people that will, try to crush individuality. They want to remove religion. They want to break down the family. They want to just make one class of people that are just reliant on the government. When you look at these movements like Black Lives Matter and Antifa, do they remind you of other organizations that broke down societies?
I support the Black Lives Matter movement, and I do because I do think it reflects the grievances that Black people in this country who have been discriminated against for centuries feel. I do not, under any circumstances, support expression of any views or anyone's form of supremacy, like white supremacy in the form of violence. And so what really reminds me of my experience in Bosnia and what I talk about extensively in my book, The Cat I Never Named, is the sense of uncertainty and sense of othering and sense of hatred that we all feel today. Just to give you an example, a couple of years ago, when my younger daughter, Dina, was in 3rd grade, she came home from school and asked me, a kid who is gifted, who loves seahorses and science, asked me, Mom, what will happen to me if, as Muslims, you and Dad are rounded up and taken away? Will Jana, her older sister, and I be left alone? And that was the question that scared me as a Bosnian Muslim, as a genocide survivor, as an educator, as a parent. It made me realize that as a genocide survivor, I needed to warn Americans where hatred can take us. And when I say that, I mean any form of hatred against any group. And so I do think that Black Lives Matter represent a call for all Americans to simply
Okay, but Doc, I got to ask you this because, as I said in my open, okay, if you say to me, Black Lives Matter as a sentence, I'm with you. I 100% am with you, right? But I have an issue with the organization that is in the front of that movement because they're avowed Marxists, right? They're on the record as saying they're Marxists. So, as someone who survived genocide, and you know Karl Marx and his followers had no problem with genocide. If you know the people who run the organization are Marxists, how does that square up with what you know to be the historical relevance of that?
Here's what I'm going to say. I grew up in communism. I grew up in a dictatorship. I grew up in a country where I had no voice. I was silenced as a young Muslim. I was terrified during the 4 years of pure executions of Bosnian Muslims. And just to give your audience a visual, only 5 cities in my entire country were not remained sort of free, if you will, for Bosnian Muslims. And even though we were bombed constantly, the Serb army never entered our city. But in the cities where Serb army did enter, they forced Bosnian Muslims to put white armbands around the arms so that we could be separated for torture and execution. And that resulted from pure desire to create ethnically pure, racially pure country.
Okay, so if you grew up in communism, Karl Marx is one of the biggest communists of all times, and you know that the folks running this Black Lives Matter movement are avowed, on the record, Marxists, do you feel good about telling your kids that you should support that organization? Not a movement to help minorities, but that particular organization.
I think the narrative in this country, unfortunately, has gotten to a point where families can't even have a conversation.
Understood.
At the dinner table. And unfortunately, what results from that is our inability to feel empathy for each other. And I have to say that for my children who are growing up in a country where they're asking me a question if I, as an educator, professor at Columbia University, would be rounded up as a Muslim, is not where I want America to be.
Okay. Doc, we got to leave it there. Thank you so much. Check out her book, The Cat I Never Named. It's Dr. Amara Sabic-El-Rayess, activist, author, Muslim refugee with plenty of expertise in what's happening in our country. Thank you very much, Doc. Quick break, back after this with the Mix It Up. David Isaac and John Burnett join us.